is an esoteric saying which is, as above, so below. The saying allows us to speculate what is happening above, which is the sky, and below, which is the earth. As we have entered a new age in our 21st century with new amazing discovery throughout the universe, and we're paying a little bit more attention to our earth, the concept of above and below can be very interesting. I'm Agneta Borstein, and I'm an astrologer, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to my program, From the Sky to Earth. Today we will explore Mercury in retrograde, and I'm very pleased to introduce you to my colleague and friend for years, Janet Booth. So welcome.
Thank you for having me, Agneta.
Yes, thank you. So we're going to speculate a little bit about Mercury retrograde today. But first I would like to say you are from West Hartford.
I
have your own show for many, many years.
14 and counting on West Hartford Community Television.
Is it 14 years?
And you've been a guest on that show several times.
Yes,
so
I have. Yes.
Now, you're getting even with me.
Well, no, we have a lot in common, so that's great. So where do we start Mercury? We're thinking about just going through some basic fundamental, people who know little astrology, which could be good, but sometimes you get in trouble by that. So often you hear, we deal with the 10 basic planets, but when Mercury goes into retrograde, everybody panics. Sometimes they don't do anything, or there's just emotion about it. So we thought Janet and I would just teach the audience just a little bit about what not to panic about. So we have some basic fundamental information. Maybe you can show the way you see Mercury, how often does it change? On the ecliptic. We have an image of the ecliptic.
And that's sort of like the pathway that all the planets follow as they orbit the sun from our viewpoint, with those signs of the zodiac as a backdrop.
Right.
And Mercury is the closest planet to the sun, so it goes around the sun about 3 times for every time the Earth goes around. So that means 3 times a year it passes between Earth and the sun, and that's when this optical illusion occurs. It's not really Mercury stopping in its tracks and backing up. That would be impossible. But just as if you've been on a train next to another train and they're both going forward, but one's faster than the other, it seems like somebody's going backwards relative to the other. So we get this backwards for about 3 weeks at a time and about 3 times a year.
And it's the fastest moving planet in our solar system. It goes really quick, and I guess that's why it comes close to us and goes retrograde at the most.
Well, because it's orbiting 3 times for our every one. And because it's so fast, I think that's why they call it Quicksilver.
Yes.
Quick.
Okay. So that just gives us a little bit. So it goes retrograde 3 times a year.
Sometimes in a calendar year, that'll be 4 portions of a calendar year.
Right, depending on where we start on this ecliptic, the great zodiac belt. So here's an illustration that Janet was talking about. So we have it from point A to 2, because we always want to move forward, but it's not always so, unfortunately. So we go backwards in motion, and that's that train phenomena that might just say, well, we're moving forward, but every once in a while we have to think a little bit more. And of course, Mercury would be the mind. We can get to those basic keywords for Mercury too. But then eventually we move forward. Eventually we have this way of going on to the A to the 5 and moving forward. So maybe we can start with saying of some of the basic fundamental basic words for Mercury. Maybe you want to help me with that.
Sure. Well, if we think in terms of correspondences between different planets or signs with the body, we find that Mercury is related to the eyes and the ears and the mouth. Things we have 2 of, even the nostrils, and the senses and the input. So it's information input, and it's also information conveyance.
Yeah, and then the whole messages about it, the communication would be the first word, and just to know that there's always, as I remind every time I have this show, about there's the positive and the negative. So in that process, you express yourself, you might write something. For example, when Mercury goes retrograded, I find myself very productive. If I pay attention to it, you can get a lot of writing done. It could be a few mistakes, but then moving forward is also about what you say during that time. Because that's, to me, I don't know about you as a professional astrologer, people are a little scared of Mercury retrograde.
Well, after the phenomenons of new moons and full moons and eclipses, probably the most talked about thing by the general public regarding astrology is Mercury retrograde. And still a lot of people haven't heard of it.
No, that's true too, but I'm also basing it, the fun part about people know a little astrology and they get in trouble and they just stop the world at times. So I'm trying to be positive about looking at this period, most of the time 30 to 45 degrees. What is the highest days it can be retrograde? But 45
the most
days?
number of days that it's actually backwards is about 24 maybe. It's usually average around 21, 22.
Average, Sometimes it's
something
longer,
like that.
It depends on that.
Right, but you mentioned like writing, and I find it's very good for rewriting and for editing and reviewing and proofing and things like that. But yes, you can make some mistakes and you can also catch some mistakes.
Right. And then many times afterwards when it goes direct,
And it's kind of famous for finishing unfinished business. So that pile of filing that's been sitting there on the desk for 2-3 months, it's like, oh, Mercury retrograde comes, time to get that filed away.
I have to wait for the next phase that we will get into too. And it also is interesting with the Mercury, the mind. It has, of course, we will get into the Gemini, the dexterity, the change of it. There's a little bit of worries and with Mercury too. And
well, the idea of the mind going over something again and again and again. And people who might be born during a Mercury retrograde, I oftentimes tell them, you feel like you've had a conversation with somebody in your head because you've practiced it so many times. You go about your business as if it really happened, and the other person's clueless because you never got it out of your mouth. And just twirling around and the changeable part of it,
And of course, when we talked about what to talk about today for this show, we talked about the Mercury is also used, how you move things. So cars, don't buy a car when Mercury retrograded. And both Janet and I did.
We should have known better, but I was just a young astrologer
then. Of course, I think mine was 20 years ago plus, and I still remember the day, and it was just as you look back at it, you say that the practical part, don't buy any cars when Mercury is retrograded because it will be some kind of mechanical problems because you try to move forward. So it's also the memory or lack of memory. If Mercury was retrograded in your own sign, then it's really like dexterity time. But it's also that part of what I find that, yes, we can correct a lot during that time. We might want to look at, and maybe you want to show the symbol of Mercury or talk about it.
Well, I like to tell my students that this is Mercury wearing its thinking cap. Looks almost like Mickey Mouse ears, so that's how you know it's the thinking planet.
Right, and bringing it to be realistic. And I guess I'm thinking about it as the Venus symbol, but also with that tone of...
It looks like Venus who put on her thinking cap.
Yes, it does. That's cute. Right. So we have different planetary, the ABC of astrology is that Gemini is the changeable, the twin, adaptable, changeable, funny and witty, and also intellectual. So that's all talks. So Gemini and Mercury goes together, including Virgo. Well. So maybe you can give that to say, well, how much do we say about that? Because they belong to, I always like Gemini, Mercury and Gemini. I don't totally connect to Mercury in Virgo, but that's my take on it, because it's too slow.
And you're also
I can't
born a Gemini.
I know. And I do. We all have, we all have Mercury somewhere, so it's...
I saw something recently that I thought was interesting, because it talks about how the other planets don't have dual rulerships. anymore anyway. We have the modern planets.
Right.
So once Uranus, Neptune, Pluto were discovered, we gave them rulerships over Aquarius, Pisces, and Scorpio, which used to be ruled by Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. Okay.
Right.
But Venus has Taurus and Libra. Mercury has Gemini and Virgo. And both Mercury and Venus have two aspects to themselves. They are the morning star sometimes. They're the evening star sometimes. So that they give Taurus to the morning star of Venus. They give Gemini to the morning star of Mercury. And Virgo goes for the evening star of Mercury, and Venus for the evening star of Libra. And I thought that makes a lot of sense.
It does, yeah.
And yet you still may find that rulership of Virgo may end up going to Ceres, which a little dwarf planet.
Right.
Or,
right.
And I hear people kicking around the idea of another dwarf planet, the new one, Eris, giving that to Libra, but I'm not a fan of that planet. No. But I love my Venus, I'm a Libra.
Yeah, right,
so
right.
I don't want to give that up.
No.
But Gemini really does have a very strong affinity with Mercury.
That's, how far I
Absolutely.
know. Yeah, yes.
And it's the sign about learning. It even relates on a developmental level to like the early years when speech is developed, and it's related to our younger school experience.
Right. And also, come to think about it, there's a lot of information in your, not only on your web page, but in your calendar that you write.
Oh, Jen,
that takes you the whole summer to
plan
write.
Yes, it's a wealth of information.
Right. But you have a certain section of Mercury retrograde, or Mercury in general?
There's a specific page, and actually that can be extracted. It's a free download on my website.
Okay.
And the website is astrologybooth.com.
Okay.
And it's what I call on a page. And it's a bar chart with all of the planets, their retrogrades, what days they start and end it, what part of the zodiac they do that in. And it has all the new and full moons on it as well.
And it's easy enough access if one of your audience have just joined us. If you have just joined us, this is a program about astrology. And the title is From the Sky to Earth. And today we're talking about Mercury retrograde. And this is my guest, Janet Booth, and I'm Agneta. So welcome. So that's an interesting point. There's a lot of information in that booklet, or book, or calendar.
Yes, it is a book. It grew from a calendar into a book. But since you mentioned the website, there is a section there called the Information Booth. With articles. And one of the articles is all about Mercury retrograde.
Great.
And it talks about some things that have happened in history with Mercury retrograde and famous people who have had Mercury retrograde.
And as in United States of America's natal chart has Mercury retrograded.
Yes.
Should think twice before decisions are made, and we don't go into the political realm, but we do know the natal chart from July 4th, 1776. That's how Mercury retrograded.
Yes.
So that would mean that when it's retrograde, especially if it was in the zodiac sign, don't do any different important decisions.
You would hope.
Should we tell them?
You would hope. But what I find interesting about that is Mercury retrograde can mean to repeat or rediscuss what's been talked about before.
That's great, yeah.
But there's some things we've already supposedly made our mind up on, and we still keep going over it again and again and again. And that's very typical of Mercury retrograde.
Right.
But it's a great beginner article in the information booth.
Yes.
Right.
And well, we could also say, well, because it belongs to Gemini, we can also maybe look at this period that we have, just kind of in the beginning of the year. Typically, it's retrograded 3 times a year. So we would perhaps share with the audience how was it in January 21st through February 11th. And sometimes you don't want to say exactly, but
I'm trying to remember.
I don't know. It was in Aquarius, January. Well, we were just trying to get out of the snow here in Connecticut.
Yeah.
So I do find that I do pay attention to it, of course. So maybe the next period of Mercury retrograded is May 18th through June 11th. That is in Gemini. So I would like for you to speculate on that, because if you know your chart, which now you can come up with free internet sources to calculate your chart. So this time, to me, preparing May 18th to June 11th, there's a lot of, because it is in Gemini, so do you have anything to share about that? Should we just like forget the world and do this kind of syndrome as some people do that don't know? It's
well, for people who have not yet known what it is, and it's the first time they're going to pay attention to a Mercury retrograde, it's a perfect Mercury retrograde to start with, because it's in the sign that it rules.
Right.
And when we talk about the two of them being associated with all forms of communication and also all forms of ground transportation. So if you get in a plane or you go on a ship, that's not Gemini. But you're driving around, or you're a pedestrian, or you're on the bike, or you're on a train, or you're on the bus. Leave extra time if you have to get someplace important on time, because generally this is more traffic snarls or some kind of funky delays, weird things going on. Yes. And
losing suitcases, as I did last time I traveled.
Oh, yes.
When Mercury was retrograded. Not only once, but 3 times I lost them. And the last time I just had to laugh. This was 3 different ports. I'm very fortunate to have traveled, but so I almost canceled my trip, but it was many people involved, including my family, and I'm like,
so you had to go.
I gotta go, you gotta go, but you pack an extra, you don't pack just your toothbrush, you pack like a bag. It didn't help, and you just have to so much respect that universe. And the last time, the second time was hard. First time was like, really? And then the second time was a little hard, and the third time I was just laughing about it, because you respect it so much, you know it, and you don't try to manifest events during this time, but a little cautious,
Well, when we were talking about what we would talk about for the show, which is really good, it's kind of like repeating now what we said before, which is so retrograde. But I said, oh, that happened to me too, and I went and I looked, and it was also a Mercury retrograde when I traveled. And the luggage, it got on the plane and off the plane It's once it's off the plane, when it has to do the ground, or just the belt, or whatever. And 2 times on that same trip, also my luggage was lost. And another thing we talked about too was not necessarily a good idea to buy a computer.
No, I would not do that. That's, and this is so many years ago. I mean, we mature in our 30-year experience of astrology.
Or sometimes you think you can sneak in ahead of the deadline.
Yes.
And I remember buying like a computer. It was like maybe a day to 2 days before Mercury started being retrograde. I said, well, this should be okay. No problems the first year.
And then when it caught up in the cycle.
Well, there's something in astrology we call progressions, where one day equals a year. So it was one day before, so once the day caught up, it was like as if now in this progression it's retrograde, and that's when the brain went dead on the computer and they had to give me a whole new brain and blah blah. Good thing I backed up. And before Mercury goes retrograde, back up your data.
All this details.
Absolutely.
Very interesting. And that becomes practical with the art of astrology and that whole insertion of that. So we have one retrograde period too in the fall of 2015, which is September 17th through October 9th in the sign of Libra. And we also discussed that all these different retrograde periods is in air sign. And the air is a little airhead at times, but we also ground ourselves and try to be practical and realistic.
Well,
and I know we both are professional astrology, but you try to live life and go accordingly, and just every once in a while, we just have to be very cautious. And
we're both air signs.
Yes.
And air is the medium through which sound waves travel. So that's how you can remember that air is the element that relates to communication. And when it's Libra, it's communication between partners.
Of course. Opposite Libra is Aries.
A significant other or business partner or even teammates. So this would be a time when it's important to be more aware of the information exchange.
Interesting.
And that's always a tricky thing with Mercury retrograde, or of people who are born with Mercury retrograde. I tell them sometimes you need to double check what you're hearing or how somebody else heard you. You know, because if you say turn right, and they write down turn right, and then you review it with them, and you go, oh my God, no, I meant turn left. You know, sometimes the wrong thing comes out. So, you know, something like Libra, it is about, like we said, balance, fairness.
Listen to people.
So there might be issues that have been addressed once before about something that was unfair, and now it's starting to happen again, and you have to go back and talk about it again, and you
again,
know, stuff like
well,
that.
we try to follow the sky, if you will, with that, but we also try to live with astrology and make it into practical application. So whatever we try, but I think after my experience with a car, which is probably over 20 years ago, there's no way. I mean, I could give you the details, but
sad,
a brand new car
yes.
that blew up and whatever else with the brakes, and that's kind of shaky.
I think one thing you might want to talk about here is when you write the word station up there. Because just as sort of a train can pull into a station and then pull out again, you know, especially if it's at the terminus, okay. But that's how it seems when any planet changes its direction with this retrograde phenomenon. It seems to stop at the time that the retrograde begins and stop again at the end when it becomes direct in motion again. And therefore it's motionless for 2 or 3 or 4 days around that date. And that's the most kind of precarious and delicate time, is when it's motionless. Because we're used to quick thinking, and now it's like, no, I can't decide.
And that's when you do make
bad decisions. Oh, and Libra is such an indecisive sign to start with. Weigh and balance, weigh and balance.
Yeah, and that's when everybody tries to move forward, but it's always like that, those mistakes that we were talking about comes up then, and you try to correct them, and you go like, how is that possible? And so that's but we learn.
Well, for people who like to go online, if you just do a search on Mercury Retrograde, you'll find all kinds of stories and Right. And also, you know, just one image which is quite strong. You find it's about the myth is kind of hard to get because he wasn't like a popular god the way I understand it, but he does come with the wings in you know, his image, and supposedly also poetry. So that's part of the writing, and there's a lot of interesting aspects to images anyway. So we don't have anything else to share with, because I would like to just say something too. It's not only Mercury that goes retrograde. Most planet does. It's just because Mercury rules communication. We thought this would be one to allow the audience to know just a little bit more about astrology and how we work it on positive ways. Yes, and he also rules commerce. So these are things that we're all involved with, communication and commerce, and that's why we notice the Mercury retrograde.
And as I prepare this, you just assume because we're changing so much with the iPhone, and sometimes I think that's Uranus, but it's still the phones.
Still Mercury.
It's still Mercury, So the iPhones, I mean, the joke is like, how come we used to know where our phones were at all the time? I'm in the car half the time, it's like my phone. So it has that.
We can't live without our phone now.
No, and then you forget it, and that's in your mind.
And more business is done on phones now. I mean, like
totally, and so with the computers and all that. But the computer would be not communication, but it's still how we communicate in such a strong speed or fast or interaction on a different level.
Absolutely.
So very interesting.
Well, sometimes they picture him with wings on the feet and wings on the head.
Right. So we want to thank Janet Booth for coming to visit me today. Please come again.
I'd love to.
And I do want to thank Nutmeg Television for allowing us to bring practical subject to the audience. And I thank you again. This is From the Sky to the Earth. Thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you.